social justice, and the gospel. I'm Cody Leibold, and I'll be talking today with Jacob Brunton. Both of us write at For the New Christian Intellectual, and you can find that at christianintellectual.com. In the evangelical world, there has been a discussion this week and kind of a debate, and it's something that we want to share our opinions and also ask you for your feedback. So this is an Ask Me Anything on the topic of social justice and the gospel, and we'll try to address your questions as well as report on what we know that's happening right now. Something that you might want to do is go to statementonsocialjustice.com, and that will get you to see something that we're going to be talking forward. All right, I'm bringing Jacob on the call.
Here I am.
All right, Jacob, let's start talking about this social justice discussion. Why is this so big this week?
Well, the statement on social justice just came out, and there were some pretty big signers: John MacArthur, Vodi Bakum, James White, and a number of others who helped to draft it. And lots of people have signed it. I think we're up to, what, 7,000 signatures? Is that right? As you just said, you can find it on statementonsocialjustice.com. And it was a statement of a lot of Christian pastors and others who were concerned about the emphasis on social justice that has been seeping into the church. And this is something that you and I have written about and talked about quite a bit in the past. And it's starting to gain traction among conservative Christians who are concerned about a potential liberalizing of Christian theology, and a number of other potential problems that are coming into the church through this emphasis on social justice.
So tell me a little bit about how you became aware of this situation.
I don't remember the first time I saw anything about social justice, but I do remember being concerned about the language and the apparent connotations, because of the fact that the culture, especially the culture of the progressive left, started using that language a lot right before people in the church started using it a lot. And some people will argue, well, the term social justice has been around in Christian circles for centuries. Yes, it's true, but it hasn't been used on a popular level the way that it has been in the last few years until after the progressive left culture started using it. And that's something to keep in mind. The context here is really important.
Now, you've written several articles at our site. You've written addressing Tim Keller's perspective on social justice. You've also written several articles related to race and how you think we should think about race issues. All of this is hopefully going to be helpful for people, so definitely find it at christianintellectual.com, and you can just look in the articles. But what do you want to talk about in this discussion right now?
So there's been a lot of confusion about social justice kind of on both sides, and I think it's really helpful to talk through it in general. There's a lot of hesitancy to interact, especially it seems like people who are coming from what we might call the leftist perspective, the people who were trying to popularize the concept of social justice. Now that people on what we might call the right, people like Vodi Bakum, James MacArthur, James White, John MacArthur, James White, now that those people are starting to engage, it seems like the others, like for instance, Russell Moore, Tim Keller, Thabiti Anyabwile, they're not engaging as much. Although, let me take that back. Thabiti has been somewhat engaging, and I'm hopeful about that. I hope that there's more engagement. But I think that you and I have a pretty unique perspective on this, and I wanted to kind of throw that in the mix and really start to get some interaction from other people also, because I know that we've got a lot of followers on Facebook and social media who like to talk about this also. One of the main things that I think is confusing is that the term social justice can seem kind of neutral, right? It can seem like it's just justice applied to a social context. In fact, Kevin DeYoung just came out with an article at the Gospel Coalition today arguing something along those lines. And I think to a certain extent, he's possibly correct. There's a sense in which the term social justice can be neutral. It can just mean whatever we mean by justice applied in a social context. But the problem is that's not the way that it has been used recently, especially by the culture. And this is something that a lot of people seem to be brushing over, and it's a little distressing. And as an example, I want to point out, if a lot of Christians today started using the term reproductive rights, talking about women's reproductive rights, and saying the church should be concerned about women's reproductive rights, what would we think that person was suggesting if they were using the term reproductive rights?
Well, I know that that's how Hillary Clinton describes abortion.
Yeah, not just Hillary Clinton, though. Is there anyone in the culture today who uses the term reproductive rights in any way other than to describe abortion?
Not that I know of.
No, not that anybody knows of, right? And so that's a parallel to the concept of social justice. In popular culture, in the wide popular level, there's no one who uses the term social justice typically to refer to anything other than leftist progressive type policies. And so if some people, especially some Christians, want to start using that term and they want to mean something other than leftist progressive type policies, then they need to be really specific and really clear about what they mean. And in the absence of such clarity, it's incumbent on us to assume that that's what they mean, that there's no other way to understand what they mean or make sense of what they mean unless they make themselves clear. And that's what's not going on. These people who are advocating for the use of the term social justice within the church are not adequately or clearly enough distinguishing what they mean from what the culture might mean. And then when other people say, hey, I don't like what the culture means by that, so I don't like you using that term, they throw up their hands and they say, oh, but I don't mean what the culture means. Well, what do you mean? Well, I'm not going to tell you. I'm just going to say I don't mean what the culture means. And that's a really twisted and deceptive and I would say unjust, ultimately, way of using terminology. That's not the way Christians should talk, especially within the church, when we're talking about things that Christians should be passionate about. And that's the idea. Christians are supposed to be passionate about social justice, according to these people in the church who are advocating for it, but they don't want to define what they mean by it. They want to leave vague innuendos that make it seem like they're talking about progressive type policies, but then when someone says, hey, we disagree with progressive type policies, they say, why do you assume I'm talking about that?
We're not making this up. Russell Moore, the other day in his podcast, said there really aren't any controversies out there about whether the gospel has anything to do with social justice. Jacob, as you think through that quote, what is he doing?
Well, so he goes on to say there are lots of people, most Christians care about issues of justice in society, in social context, and he cites abortion as an example. And that's right. There are a lot of Christians who do care about justice in a social context, for instance, abortion. But that's not what most people mean by social justice, and arguably, that's likely not all that Russell Moore means by social justice. That might be included in what he means by social justice, but he likely also means certain other things by social justice that other people disagree with, that other people would say is not an example of justice in society. So what he's doing is he's equivocating. He's using the term social justice in a way that you pointed out is a term of art to describe specific positions and attitudes in order to convey certain ideas and policies and methods of looking at society. And then when someone calls him on it, he says, no, I just mean the plain semantic dictionary definition of justice applied to society. And it's confusing to a lot of Christians because a lot of Christians want to care about justice, and they want to care about justice in a social context. And they should. We absolutely should care about justice in a social context. But there's a difference between true justice in a social context and what most people mean when they talk about social justice. And Russell Moore is not making that distinction. If he did make that distinction, there would be a lot less confusion and a lot less people wanting to debate him on the issue. And I think one of the most horrendous examples of him equivocating on this is actually when he talks about race. So he opens up his recent podcast. And by the way, for those of you who haven't listened to it, you can listen to his most recent podcast. You can find it on iTunes or any other podcast provider. In the first 3 minutes, he says, he starts off with what Cody just quoted, him saying where, there's really not a controversy about whether or not social justice is an implication of the gospel. And he sets abortion as one thing that everybody agrees on. Everybody agrees abortion is an issue of justice in society. He says it's not that there was a controversy about whether or not the gospel has implications for social justice. It's usually that's what social justice means in those contexts has to do with black or brown people. Right? So he's saying usually when people are objecting to social justice within the church, what they really object to is social justice in regard to black or brown people. And he goes on to say, I've had people say that they want to work together on things like abortion and the disabled and other things involving human dignity, but we don't want to talk about racial issues because that's a distraction. And then he asks them, well, do you think that abortion is a distraction? And they say no. And he asks, well, do you think that disabilities are a distraction? And they say no. And so then he says, so really what it is you just don't want to talk about race. You see race as a distraction. And the implication is these people who don't want to talk about racial issues because they're afraid of losing funding, he says, or because they're afraid of losing their audiences or whatever the case may be, and most likely he's talking about pastors here, his insinuation is that these people don't really care about racism, or they don't care about justice when it comes to race. And I think the problem here is that what he means by justice applied to race is very likely not what most people would mean by justice when it's applied to race. And that's because he likely has bought into this idea, this new idea of racism that I'd like to call neo-racism, where, so old school racism, the type of racism that Cody and I would agree with, and the type of racism that most other people, I think, in America would agree is an evil thing that needs to be condemned. Old school racism is judging people by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. It's assigning undue moral significance to the color of someone's skin. That's old school racism. That's something that almost everybody condemns, universally in America, right? And that's the reason why racism is such, like, the charge of racism is so feared, because everyone agrees that what we call what I'm calling old school racism is evil. Like, it's one of the worst social evils possible in America today. But what Russell Moore likely means by racism or racial justice or however you want to put it is this neo-racism, this new idea of racism that's come from the progressive left that has to do with critical race theory and intersectionality and mere statistical disparities. It's this idea that only a majority, only those who have the skin color of the majority who's in power at the time are capable of being racist, and those who are part of a skin color that's considered the minority or underprivileged can't possibly be racist. It's the idea that you can determine whether or not racism is happening merely by looking at statistical disparities and nothing else. It's the idea that in order to right racial injustices, we have to fix all statistical disparities and make them all even. See, all of this is coming in from really convoluted academic arguments from the progressive left. And this is a new concept of racism that many people in the church are just too innocent to understand. They're too innocent to comprehend. You start talking about critical race theory and black people can't be racist because they're not part of the dominant power structure, and all, like, people, I think, in the church are rightly looking at that and saying, that's crazy. What? I don't understand that. That's controversial, and I don't want to be involved with that. I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to talk about critical race theory. I don't want to talk about intersectionality. I don't want to talk about statistical disparities and say that that's racism. But that's what Russell Moore and many of his colleagues want to call racism or racial justice or racial injustice, or whatever the case may be. And then when people say we don't want to talk about that, they come around and say, oh, well, you must not care about racism. You must not care about justice when it comes to race. And that's a horrible slander against those people. These poor Christians, these poor average Christians who aren't in the academic setting, they're not prepared to wrestle with these convoluted academic arguments about critical race theory and intersectionality. They don't even know what half these words mean. All these concepts are completely new. And these people in the church, these church leaders like Russell Moore and Tim Keller and Thabiti Anyabwile and Pastor Eric Mason and Anthony Bradley, all of these guys are coming in and saying, if you don't agree with this new convoluted view of racism, then you must not care about race. That's wicked. That is something that Christians should not stand for.
I want to remind everybody that this is an Ask Me Anything on social justice and on the gospel. So definitely chime in with questions or just even statements. I want to read a couple of statements. Roshad and Denisha said they've redefined the terms, which thank you, because that's exactly what's going on. And then, so we've got other quotes coming in too. But Jacob, here's something that I wrote down when I was thinking about this earlier. We agree that justice is important. Caring about justice is an important implication of taking Christian teaching seriously. So if somebody is framing it to say that there are people that don't think that, that's absurd. What we disagree about is not the relative importance of justice. It's not like we're saying, oh, you're just overemphasizing this. No. We want to emphasize justice too. We have a disagreement about what kind of things are just.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that we need to get into here, right? So there is, I think, and I want to admit to kind of throw a bone to our ideological opponents. I do want to admit that there are some Christians on the right, roughly speaking, conservative Christians and whatnot, who kind of say, well, let's not talk about that. Let's just focus on the gospel, right? But and I do want to say that's not the right attitude. We want to say, yes, the gospel has certain implications for what we do in society and certain implications for what we call justice in society and for what we advocate as justice in society. I want to agree with that. But don't think that those people are saying that's not a gospel issue, let's not talk about it, because they don't care at all. Most likely it's the same thing with the race issue like a second ago. What most people mean by social justice, especially these new people in the church who are bringing it up all the time, is typically super convoluted. It again has to do with things like intersectionality and all these highfalutin leftist progressive terminologies that they're not familiar with. And so it's understandable for them to be confused and kind of throw their hands up in the air and say, I don't want to talk about that, let's just focus on the gospel. What they're really saying, I think, is I don't understand that. I'm not sure I completely agree with it. I don't even know where to start to try to figure out how to understand it because there's no one out there helping me understand it. I'm just being beaten over the head with this moral pietism that's saying that I have to agree with this or else I'm not a good Christian. And they're rightfully, I think, rebelling against that and saying, no, shut up. I'm just going to focus on the gospel. And I think that's a good knee-jerk reaction. I think they need to move beyond the knee-jerk reaction. But I think that's a healthy knee-jerk reaction to say, hey, stop trying to lord this over me, you social justice warriors. I want to focus on the gospel. Now, to move beyond that, I want to say, yes, Christians should care about social justice, meaning we should care about justice in society. But the first thing we should care about is getting justice right. And that's what these Christians who are advocating for social justice don't care to do. That they want to equivocate on what justice is and allow certain progressive ideologies to inform their view of justice in society, and then imply that if you don't agree with them, then you don't care about justice. And so I want to say the conservative attitude, the conservative pushback, the conservative strategy needs to move beyond let's just focus on the gospel, into, hey, no, what you're calling justice is actually injustice. What you're advocating for as justice in society is actually injustice. Let's look at justice according to Scripture. Let's look at justice according to Christian theology, and let's square that against what these guys are advocating as justice, and point out how they are actually advocating for injustice. And that's the way that we can win back not only the terminology, but the moral high ground, by saying not only do we have deep roots in the gospel, but the gospel has certain implications for what justice is and what justice isn't in society. And these guys are out of line with that, and we are in line with that.
So we agree that there are misrepresentations and there are equivocations possible through use of terms, and so that therefore we should be careful, and especially our opponents on this debate should be more careful about how they use the terms. But let's talk now about substance. So tell me, what is your theory of how justice should work in our society, both in terms of the laws that we should have and in terms of, is there some other kind of justice besides legal justice?
Yeah, so first of all, let me just kind of contrast this with what is typically presented as social justice by these Christians. And that is typically social justice is thought of as almost synonymous with being nice, right? So if you can think of something that Christians can or should do in order to be nice in society, then that's what we're going to call social justice. And I want to say, where in the world are you getting that idea of justice, where justice means being nice? Don't you realize that God's execution of justice entails eternal conscious torment? Don't you realize that God's execution of justice includes the execution of the Son of God in the most gruesome and horrifying way possible? So justice is not synonymous with niceness, and neither is social justice synonymous with being nice in a social context. That's the first thing to notice. So then the question is, all right, well, what is justice? In order to figure out what justice is in a social context, we have to ask, what is justice in general? And justice in general is giving people their due, giving people what they're owed. And the question is, well, what are people owed? And this is where the concept of social justice also falls short, the way it's advocated by many Christians. Most Christians, like Tim Keller, sometimes Russell Moore, some others, when they talk about social justice and talk about giving people their due, they have in mind what people are due based on what they need, right? So if someone needs something, then it's an act of justice to give them what they need. And so if you want to ask, well, what are people due in a social context? To answer that, you have to ask and answer, well, what do they need? And whatever they need is what justice requires you to give them in a social context. That's according to these social justice advocates within the Christian church. But since when is that what justice means? Since when does justice mean giving people what they need? Let's step back and apply that to God for a second. Let's apply that to the gospel. Are we needy of anything in respect to God? Yes. Right? So let's back up. This idea of social justice based on need is the Marxist idea. It's the idea of from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Well, God is infinitely able, and we are infinitely needy. And what does that mean on this view of social justice? It means that God would be unjust if he did not fulfill all of our needs. It means that when God threatens us with hell for not obeying him, he's being a moral monster. He's being unjust. Justice, according to these people, would demand that God fulfill all of our needs without any demands. That he do it without any conditions. So this concept of justice based in need flips the gospel on its head. Well, where's room for grace? If justice means God filling our needs, then that means God owed us the cross of Christ. That means that God owes us the gospel. God owes us heaven. In fact, there's no need for the cross of Christ. God is the one who has done injustices against us because he's the privileged party. God is infinitely privileged in comparison to us. How could we possibly be guilty of anything against him when we're the needy ones? We're the underprivileged. He's the privileged party. He's the privileged race. He's the privileged species, the privileged being. The privileged one owes us everything until we're equaled out, according to this view of justice. So there was no need for the cross. This nullifies the grace of God. This nullifies the gospel. This nullifies everything about Christianity. So now, what does justice actually look like? Well, what does justice look like in the gospel? What would justice be? It would be God giving us what we deserve. What do we deserve? Hell. Because, what does Paul say in Romans? The wages of sin are death. Meaning, justice is you getting what you deserve, and what you deserve is determined by your earnings, what you earn, what you merit. That's the idea of wages. You sow sin, you earn death. So justice is you getting what you've earned. And in God's economy, we earn nothing. That's why the gospel has to be accepted by faith rather than by works. It has to be accepted as a gift, as grace, not as justice. We dare not call the gospel an act of social justice where God is one person and we're another and he's being just to us. No, the gospel is a gift. It's grace. It's charity because we don't deserve it, because we didn't earn it. We couldn't earn it. Now, what if that's what justice means? If justice means giving people what they've earned, not what they need, what they've earned, if that's what justice means in the gospel, then we dare not change the meaning of justice when we go to apply it in society. So what does that mean? What does justice mean in society? It means giving people what they earn, what they're due based on what they earn. In other words, their wages, as Paul would say in Romans 5. And that means that what most people are advocating for as social justice, namely giving to people according to their needs, is not actually justice. It's grace. It's charity.
Hey.
I'm going to pause there and see if we've got any interaction.
Yeah, we've got several comments, and I've been skimming through them to see which ones are most useful for the video. But thank you for clarifying this distinction. Jacob, I want to ask you a question. Does, in your mind, are the concepts of charity and justice mutually exclusive? They're not an overlap between those two?
Yes. Yes, if we're talking about the same people in the same context, right? So if we're talking about like you and me, for example, and I'm giving you something, it's either charity or it's justice, meaning you either deserve it or you don't. If you deserve it, then it's justice. If you don't deserve it, then it's charity. You can't deserve it and not deserve it at the same time. Just like between us and God, it can't be both justice and charity in the same respect, because that would mean that we deserve it and we don't deserve it at the same time. So when we're talking about the same people in the same context, yes, justice and charity are mutually exclusive.
Okay, so as I understand the impulse of the Catholics that invented the concept of social justice, and as I understand the writings of Tim Keller, you're disagreeing with them because they would hold that acts of charity are obligations to Christians, especially because of the fact that we are servants of God. And then they would say, well, then any act of service to God is justice in one sense. And then I think they make a jump, and then they say, therefore, charity is an act of justice. How do you understand that?
Yeah, so, well, the first thing to understand is there's got to be something wrong with what they're saying because of what we just talked about, right? The fact that line of reasoning leads to the idea that God owed us the gospel should make us pump the brakes pretty hard and say, all right, maybe we went wrong somewhere. And in fact, they did. They went wrong because they equivocated between different senses of justice. And the best way to understand this is when we talk about justice, we talk about giving someone what they're due. All right, so when we talk about justice, we should be thinking about justice to a certain person, right? Justice is giving whom what they're due. What they're talking about when it comes to obligations, moral obligations, and especially things that God commands of us, like giving charitably to the poor, which God absolutely does demand of us, and we are morally obligated to do. The question is, to whom are we morally obligated? Or more importantly, or more specifically, to whom do we owe that? To whom do we owe that action? Answer, we owe it to God. So you could say it's an act of justice to God to give charitably to the poor, but you can't say it's an act of justice to the poor to give charitably to the poor. It's a contradiction. The poor person either deserves it or he doesn't. If he does deserve it, then it's justice. If he doesn't deserve it, then it's charity. It's grace. It's a picture of the grace of God in the gospel. It might also be justice to God. And this is actually, this distinction has been around since Aristotle. Aristotle made the distinction between universal justice, which just means one's moral obligation, or we might call it righteousness. And, and in a Christian context, we would say universal justice or righteousness is justice between us and God, right? Doing what we owe to God, giving to God what we owe. That's universal justice, which is just righteousness, being a moral person in general, right? And then there are particular forms of justice. And these particular forms of justice have to do with what is owed to other people in various contexts. And what Keller is doing there, what the Catholics are doing there, and what many other Christians are beginning to do there, is to collapse our vertical relationship to God and what we owe to God. They're collapsing it into horizontally what we owe to other people. And they're blurring that distinction between what we owe to God and what we owe to other people. And that's a really dangerous distinction. Or that's a really dangerous distinction to blur. It's really dangerous to blur that distinction.
You know, if anyone is wanting to see Jacob's thoughts on this in more depth, go to christianintellectual.com and click on articles. The most recent article is called The Content of Social Justice, a reply to Joe Carter. I guess you could find that at /social justice content with dashes in between. And he explains the words in the Hebrew that are being smushed together to form a new concept, which is, at least the way they're using it, an anti-concept or a broken concept.
Yeah. I talk in there, and this is really popular, especially among pastors. This confusion that Tim Keller made popular in his book Generous Justice, where you take these two Hebrew words, tzedakah, which generally is translated as righteousness, and mitzpah, which is generally translated as justice, and you see, oh, they're used together pretty often. And not only that, but they're used together sometimes in the context of applications to social relationships. And they say, okay, well then if we mash those two together, then we get what is contemporarily called social justice. And I want to say, whoa, hold on. First of all, is it a common hermeneutical practice to mash two Hebrew words together under one new English term simply because they're seen together often? Like that just at the outset seems like a pretty suspicious and suspect hermeneutical practice. But then beyond that, it does what we were just talking about, which is blurs the distinction between righteousness, which is what we owe to God, tzedakah, righteousness, justice to God, between us and God, and mitzpah, which is more often used as justice to other people, what we owe to other people. It blends those two together and blurs the distinction between our relationship to God and our relationship to other people.
So let's talk about what that accomplishes. If they're able to do that, I think it's an equivocation, or it's a gliding or a smushing together package deal, you could call it, Why would somebody want to do that, potentially?
Because they want to corrupt the concept of justice, right? So if you say there's no distinction now between what we owe to God and what we owe to the people, there's no distinction between righteousness, vertically understood, and justice, horizontally understood, then you can call any good thing justice, because righteousness includes every good thing. And now you can call any given good thing justice. And here's the revealing part. They're selective about what they want to call justice, right? Notice they don't say, let's call prayer justice. They don't say, let's call fellowship justice. They don't say, let's call devotions justice. And yet all of these things are included in righteousness. All of these things are expected of the Christian. All of these things are owed to God as justice. But they don't want to redefine those things as justice. What do they want to redefine as justice? They want to redefine charity as justice. They want to redefine the very thing that shouldn't be redefined as justice. The thing that would end up contradicting the gospel, they want to redefine as justice. And most likely it's because of the connotations that are coming in from the culture's use of the term social justice, which has to do with the idea of giving people what they need, the socialistic or Marxist or communistic concept of justice being based on needs, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, right? They want to bring in that connotation and make that biblical justice. But as we just saw, that ultimately is going to distort the gospel, and it can't be considered biblical justice.
Another question I have for you is about this language battle. Thank you for explaining your perspective on it. But now let's say if this is the way language is being used, some people have said, okay, well, let's just concede that, social justice, sure, it's been misused, but shouldn't we try to win it back? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. We should try to win it back. But it's important to realize that concepts have meaning in context, right? And words have meaning in context. So, and I think we started off talking about this a little bit. Kevin DeYoung, wrote an article on the Gospel Coalition today saying that the term social justice need not refer to the sort of progressive leftist ideology that it commonly refers to in our culture. And that's right. It doesn't have to. But it's important for us to understand that's what it means to most people. Apart from very carefully and explicitly defining what we mean by it, if we're going to use that term, people are going to hear the meaning that's already been supplied by the culture. And this is just like anything else, right? You can't pull a word out of the context in which it's being used on a popular level and then say, well, what's the dictionary definition and usage of that word? And that's what that person meant when he said it. No, we don't do that in Bible study. When you read a word in the Greek, if you take that word by itself and go and look up in a Greek dictionary and say, this is what that word means, therefore, that's exactly what the author meant there, you're going to get a big fat F on your exegesis paper in Bible college or in seminary because you're completely ignoring the context. You're ignoring the fact that in addition to the dictionary definition word of that, or meaning of that word, there's a given meaning that the author likely was aware of among his audience. And today our audience, when it comes to the concept or the term social justice, is primarily understanding that concept in a way that carries with it a whole bunch of progressive, leftist, ideological, academic garbage. And so it's right for conservatives to have a sort of knee-jerk reaction against that term. It would be even righter, even better for conservatives to try to win back that term. But in order to do so, you have to replace the common meaning in the culture. You can't just leave it there as if it's a neutral term, as if no one has any connotations in their mind when they hear that term. We have to fight to replace that term. And the way to do that is along the lines of what we were just talking about. We have to change the debate. We have to reframe the debate to say, yes, we absolutely should care about justice. We absolutely should care about justice in society, but you guys have it wrong. Tim Keller, Tabiti Anabuile, Anthony Bradley, Eric Mason, you guys have justice wrong. You don't understand what justice is. And so when you advocate for social justice, what you are actually advocating for is social injustice. Now here's what true justice looks like in a social context. That's what conservatives have to do if we're going to try to actually win this battle. And there's a lot that goes into that. There's a lot of nuance and study that needs to go into figuring out what is actual justice in a social context. But that's what we need to do.
In a recent article, the one that you addressed to Joe Carter, you actually concluded the article by saying, here's a hint, it's going to look a lot like capitalism. That's the part that raised eyebrows. Tell us what you mean there.
Yeah, so this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about what does justice mean? It means giving people their due, and what people are due is based on their wage. It's based on what they earn. And that's the basic concept behind capitalism. So if we're going to just specifically talk about justice in regard to the law, in regard to politics or legal stuff, then social justice, justice in society, means giving people what they've earned and not ever taking what someone has earned, which is capitalism. Capitalism is the recognition of individual rights, the recognition that, especially property rights, that people have a right to their own property. People have a right to the property that they have rightfully earned, and that it's unjust for anyone, whether it's the government, a majority, or a thief, to come around and take what he's rightfully earned from him. That's the foundation of a capitalist system, is the concept of individual property rights and the fact that it's unjust for anyone, for any reason, to take someone's rightful property away from him. So if we're going to apply justice to a social context, it's going to end up, at the very least, entailing capitalism. It might have other implications, but at the very least, it's going to entail capitalism.
Our friend A.D. Robles has a video channel, and I'd recommend go to youtube.com/AD Robles, ROBLES, and you can see him kind of exegeting Russell Moore, as Russell Moore mis-exegetes James 5:4 in regard to wages and laborers. And I think that there's just so many deceptive moves being made so frequently by those who are either moderates that are running interference for social justice, or that are far left social justice warriors, if you could even call them a warrior, or if you could even call them by anything that has to do with justice. The point being, though, that you could spend all of your life trying to unravel the webs that are being weaved, but just go to AD's video channel, and he does it in an entertaining way, and he is not bitter. He's not harsh. He just says, hey, this is not true. This is deceptive. See what he did there. See what he did there. He challenges people that are on the opposite side. Come and interact with us. And Jacob and I would say the same thing. We would like to interact with people on maybe in this format, or maybe in a pre-recorded format, or maybe offline, not recorded, because we're trying to learn. You can see that if you see our interactions on Facebook, just through our posts. We're trying to figure out, why do people think what they do, and have good faith discussions. That's what is needed. We also are not afraid to point out when there is a bad faith move being done, and that is clearly the case with Russell Moore's latest podcast.
Yeah, and it's important to realize that we need to have a little bit thicker skin, right? We can't just come at this type of debate with the attitude that, well, whatever seems nicest and feels good must be the right Christian position. And if anything feels negative or difficult or might make some people uncomfortable, then that can't possibly be the Christian position. Which, unfortunately, I think is the way that many Christians address debates like this. And you've got to have a little bit thicker skin. I mean, read your New Testament, for goodness sake, right? Read theology debates from any century prior to our own. Christians have always had much thicker skin than we do today. It's important to understand that when we're calling out ideas, we're not calling into question especially not the salvation of the people who hold those ideas, and we're not even calling into question necessarily the character of the people who hold those ideas. What we're trying to draw attention to is there are important implications to false ideas, to bad ideas. And it's important for Christians to understand what those implications are. And it's important for Christians not to play fast and loose with their words. I mean, I don't know how many people saw recently, I think, was it the Wall Street Journal? Some major news article came out today or yesterday with a headline that the majority of millennials support a social system under either socialism, fascism, or I think there was one other option, but it was all basically really, really horrible social systems that a majority of millennials support. And you gotta have a little bit of perspective. Step back and realize you want to talk about justice in society? There were horrible injustices done in the name of socialism and fascism throughout the last couple centuries. Look at Russia. Look at Nazi Germany. Look at Mao Zedong on China. Look at the Cambodian killing fields. Look at all of the destruction that has been caused by these ideologies. And that is true social injustice. If you actually care about justice, then you should really, really be passionate about warning people about the dangers of those types of social systems. Instead, it seems like we have a lot of Christians who are claiming to care about justice in society while soft pedaling and making room for those very ideas that are against justice in society. So yes, if I'm raising my voice, or if we, on the right, so to speak, raise our voices and get passionate, it's because we care about justice. Just like our opponents claim that they care about justice. And they get passionate too. But they get a pass because they seem like they're being compassionate. They're talking about people's needs. They're talking about helping the needy. They're talking about, and they're soft. They're gentle, but they're passionate about it. And you need to step back from that and think about this objectively rather than with your emotions, rather than with your heart. You need to step back, engage your mind, gird the loins of your mind, and say, what are the logical implications of that? Is that true? If it's not true, then it can't be just, because justice and truth go together.
If anyone wants to claim that they are passionate about the truth and about justice, then they ought to be passionate about defining their terms.
Yeah, which is something that we don't see going on enough today, and we need to see a lot more of.
All right, with that, I want to wrap up this video and invite you to check us out at christianintellectual.com. We have a podcast as well as blog posts, and of course we have a video channel, christianintellectual.com/YouTube. You can find this video replay later, that's where its home will be. Jacob, any closing thoughts?
Pursue justice, true justice, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the glory of God, for the sake of the witness of the church, for the sake of all that is true and good and holy in the world. Figure out what true justice is and then pursue that with all your heart. But first you got to figure it out.
We pray you will do just that. All right, thanks guys for watching the video today. See you, Jacob.
Thanks guys. Bye.